So you're starting a new web development project and you need to decide, do you want to use React or Svelte? Well, my guest today can give you a proper, unbiased evaluation of the two. I'm here with Rich Harris, creator of Svelte. Rich, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So Rich, how much React have you written in your life?
Enough to be pretty familiar with how it works. I haven't built any substantial applications with React, but I am the guy that people will sometimes come to for help with their React code, because as a framework author, you gotta study the enemy.
I'm glad we got that clip on camera. Perfect. So you know enough React to be dangerous. I have a question about this, and it's following a little bit on a conversation you had with my colleague Alex a few months back. You guys were talking about how Svelte is a compiled language and React is a runtime language. I want to know, do you think that gives Svelte kind of like an unfair advantage?
It gives us, the makers of Svelte, a bit of an advantage in that we have just a much larger space in which to search for solutions to problems, because we're not trying to shoehorn everything into, a language that I would argue is fundamentally badly designed for the task that we put it to. I don't think that JavaScript is a good language for describing user interfaces, and a rendering framework's job is essentially to try and bully JavaScript into being suitable for UI development. HTML, on the other hand, is a great language for describing user interfaces as long as they're static. And so for me, the gap between HTML and a good language for describing user interfaces is just adding some interactivity, whereas the gap between JavaScript and a good language for user interfaces is much larger. So there are definite advantages from a design standpoint, but in other ways, it's definitely not an advantage. In terms of being able to use existing tooling and things like that, most frameworks don't have to write their own type checker. We have to have this separate package for type checking inside Svelte components and things like that. So it swings and roundabouts. I think we made the right choice. Your mileage may vary. A lot of people just fundamentally don't want to touch anything that isn't JavaScript, and that's fine. But I would say it gives us an advantage, but certainly not an unfair one. Mm-hmm. And a lot of frameworks are adopting compilers themselves. Like last week, React 19 was announced, and it has a compiler. It's experimental for now, but React now has a compiler. Most frameworks have a compiler, and I think we're starting to see a broad agreement that the more work you can do before your application runs, the better it's going to be for users. And so there's different ideas about what a compiler means. One of Twitter's favorite topics to discuss is the exact meaning of the word compiler. But it seems like everyone is kind of drifting in that direction. So, while we are probably the framework that is most strongly associated with the idea of compilers, I don't think it gives us a leg up over everyone else anymore.
But I hear what you're saying, that React has a compiler, Vue has a compiler, but there's still languages that are fundamentally designed for runtime. Do you think it's inevitable that compile time, since increasingly all code that we write for the web is compiled or transpiled or whatever, inevitably, do you think it's inevitable that compiled languages, whether Svelte or some other up-and-comer, will eventually overtake languages that are designed for runtime?
I wouldn't say inevitable, no. There have been more expansive attempts than Svelte to apply this line of thinking. I'm thinking of things like Elm or Mint is a language that is designed specifically for designing user interfaces. And, candidly, these things haven't seen the adoption that they probably deserve. And a lot of that is because of this familiarity gap. People just don't want to have to learn a new language. And I think Svelte has largely avoided that trap because it is very similar to HTML. In fact, we call ourselves a superset of HTML. Mm-hmm. And so if you know HTML and if you know CSS and you know JavaScript, then you know Svelte. You don't have to learn an additional thing. And so maybe someone will come along and prove me wrong, but I don't think that someone is going to design the ideal language for user interfaces and see adoption with it, because people are too busy to learn new stuff.
And in theory, you actually could write a Svelte app with no JavaScript.
You could. I mean, it wouldn't do very much. But, yeah,
but
could.
Like you could just use it as a templating language like that.
Yes, and you know, some people do.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely possible. I think there are probably better languages for that. Like you may as well just write Markdown at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Astro is a great example of a framework that has leaned very heavily in that direction.
Right.
We are a little bit more focused on being able to create richly interactive applications.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, absolutely.
In theory, on the flip side, you can still write React code and send it directly to the browser. Do you think that for React and Vue, that's still an advantage?
That is an interesting question. For React, not so much. I mean, no one really writes React that way. It's sort of, it's quote unquote possible, but no one does it. For Vue, it's a bit more of a realistic option. And in fact, a lot of Vue's usage comes from people just dropping a script tag on their page and decorating some existing HTML. That's not where we want to be. Like, we think that the best way to build applications is to have a tighter integration between the page and the things on the page. But it's a thing that the Vue community has got a lot of mileage out of, and I don't expect them to give that up anytime soon. And there are other projects with like a similar focus, like Alpine is an example of that, where rather than trying to own the application development, they're just like a thing that you add at the end. So yeah, that's great for them. It's not where we want to be.
Mm-hmm. So you jokingly referred to React as the enemy, but like we all know that this is actually like a very collaborative, cooperative space where there's like a lot of idea sharing and a lot of respect for the different players. And in that spirit, what do you generally tell people are the advantages of using React over Svelte?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely not the enemy at all. We have boundless respect for the React team and the work that they do. Obviously, if you want to work in front end, then knowing React is a huge advantage. There are jobs available if you write Svelte, but there are jobs available if you write React. And so there's like it's a thing that you need to know. If you're going to be a front end developer today, then you need to at least have a passing familiarity with React. But the framework has a lot of capabilities that we don't yet. Managing asynchronous operations in a coordinated fashion is something that Svelte isn't great at, candidly. Our server-side rendering is fully synchronous. So if you have some data that loads lazily, then that has to be outside the rendering process. Whereas in React, you can like capture your dependencies, your data dependencies as part of the component, which
You're talking about React server components there?
I'm talking about React server components. I'm also talking about suspense.
Okay.
The fact that it's possible to manage asynchronous work across different components without them having to manually coordinate with each other. Mm-hmm. It's a very cool idea. And that's an idea that, every framework is eventually going to adopt in some form. So
when you say every framework, you mean Svelte is going to have to reckon with this at some point?
Absolutely. So there was this idea many years ago that you should keep your concerns separated, and gradually people came to understand that that's not really true. Like, you actually want to have the behaviors that relate to your markup described in the same place. Mm-hmm. You want them to be co-located. Svelte took that one step further and said, well, we want styles to be co-located with your markup as well, because they relate to each other. And because we're a superset of HTML, we can put all of those in the same file. But then React came along and said, that's great, but what we really want to have is our data co-located with our components. That is a separation of concerns that makes no sense. And gradually, like the trajectory, the path of evolution is towards having all of the things in one place and not having this arbitrary separation where your data loading happens over here and it sort of gets fed into your component over here, and then maybe you're pulling in some styles from over there. Like that, you want that to be in the same place. Malte Ubel, who's the CTO at Vercel, where I work, he talks about deletability a lot. Like if you can remove some code from your code base and there are vestiges of it left behind, like you're still pulling in the styles that relate to the markup that no longer exists, or you're still fetching some data over the network that is no longer being rendered by a component, then you've failed. But that is the fate of just about every code base eventually. And React, because perhaps of its background in building very, very large applications at Meta, that's the kind of problem that they've spent many years thinking about how to solve. And we just haven't, because our background has been different. Like Svelte came out of a need to create richly interactive widgets on a very short time frame. And so that is definitely an area where React is far ahead of us. And there are, I'm sure there are others. The ecosystem obviously is one thing that people talk about a lot. If you need to solve a problem in React, then someone has probably already solved it for you, and you can just install a thing from npm. Kind of a blessing and a curse. We talk about in Svelte the fact that very often you don't need to use an external package because it's easier to just use the platform in many cases, and libraries don't need special Svelte integrations the way they sometimes need special React integrations. But aside from that, like the fact that so much work has gone into solving problems in the React world is a huge advantage if you're a React developer.
So jobs, ecosystem, maybe advanced data handling, or data handling in really large applications are areas where React is obviously especially powerful.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Svelte does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to logic and JavaScript. React doesn't, I feel like React doesn't hide as much of that. I mean, it kind of does with hooks and stuff. Do you think that somebody who comes to web development as a React developer will have a more intimate understanding of JavaScript than somebody who comes to web development as a Svelte developer?
Honestly, I think the reverse is true. Particularly when Svelte 5 comes out, and we're removing some of the magic that exists in Svelte 4. But even today, I think, if you come to web development and you learn React first, which a lot of people do, a huge number of people learn React first, then you're kind of learning React and not JavaScript. And yes, React is JavaScript in a sense, but it's also very much not. Like, you are learning a very specific style of programming, and the way that hooks work is like it's not how functions normally work. Like the idea that the return value of a function depends on like when it was last called and whether it was previously called and what it was last called, like all of these things, that's just not how JavaScript typically behaves. And obviously, like, you can do many things with JavaScript, and like that is implemented without any magic, but it still like sort of violates your expectations. And so, the way that you learn how to solve problems in React versus how you would have solved them without React, they're quite different things, I think. Whereas in Svelte, I think we are pushing people towards more idiomatic JavaScript solutions to problems. And I think people who are familiar with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but have not yet encountered a framework, very often will see that those people take to Svelte much more naturally than they'll take to React, because it's just more natural.
That feels counterintuitive to me, and maybe that's why you started there. When I learned React, I kind of felt like this is all just JavaScript. I don't know if I ever fully understood how hooks work, but when it was taught to me, I kind of understood, like, okay, like I could probably figure out how to implement this or work with this, like by understanding the code base better. Whereas when I look at runes, I think this is kind of magic. Like, I don't need to understand how this works. Are you saying that you don't feel like that's the case? Like, it is just JavaScript and you can kind of understand it in those terms?
So I think when I say that it's more idiomatic, I mean the fact that, if you have a component that is on the page and it's on the page for a while, and the state comes in the form of props, and there's internal state that changes, and then maybe eventually the component goes away. Like, the component is instantiated once, and the contents of the script tag, it runs once. Whereas in React, you're running that code again and again and again. And so you have to understand closures very deeply. You have to understand why things might get stale. And that is not how JavaScript typically works, but it's not really how our brains work. Like you think about a component or an instance of a component, and it's a thing. Like you talk about it as if it is a thing. But in React, it's not a thing. In React, everything is sort of this transient sort of state of flux. And so you can get quite philosophical about this. You know, the world is in a state of flux, and the labels that we assign to things, they're models of it's our internal representation. It doesn't describe anything in the objective world, and React is actually a more faithful extension of that idea. But the human brain has evolved to think in terms of concrete objects, and I think that some of the ways in which people get confused about lifecycle in React can sort of be traced back to that. We think in terms of objects, and React thinks in terms of functions.
It feels like what you're getting at when you talk about flux versus objects is the difference between event-driven and state-driven development.
Kind of, yeah. It's difficult to fully articulate this in a way that doesn't sound like it's very abstract nonsense. But it's something.
What else are we doing here?
Yeah, it's definitely something that I've seen people struggle with when looking at code and not really being able to understand, like, you know, why is this rerunning, or what does it mean that it's rerunning?
Mm-hmm. But JavaScript is an event-driven language, and I feel like JavaScript does kind of exist in a state of flux.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is why I think JavaScript is fundamentally not a great language for UI development, because it is event-driven. But when you're describing user interfaces, you want things to be state-driven. Mm-hmm. Like, are you slicing space or are you slicing time? Like, those are two very different things.
Let's keep going.
And all a framework is essentially is a way to allow you to model state-driven programming in an event-driven language.
Mm-hmm. So I'm in the process of converting a Next.js code base to Svelte right now. And I keep on coming across these little pieces of React or Next.js syntax that I really kind of feel like I bang my head against a little bit. So aside from this being a really contrived example, how do we get here? How do we get to the place where the Sveltekit, where the Svelte component is so concise, where the React component is so verbose?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it is extremely contrived. Normally, it's not quite that egregious. But this is, I think, what happens when you start from one set of priorities as opposed to a different set of priorities. You know, Svelte is very relentlessly focused on, like, these pragmatic goals, like how quickly can we express an idea. And React is focused on different things. It's focused on being able to integrate with, like, the rest of your application. Like, it's all JavaScript. Like, everything that you see there is, well, not valid JavaScript, but valid JSX at least. If you wanted, you could extract part of that out into another function, and you could move it to a different file or elsewhere in that module. So it's like composable in a certain way that Svelte maybe isn't. And, you know, most of the time you're not going to need to write that sort of thing. So maybe focusing on that case hasn't been a big priority. And a lot of people prefer that. A lot of people look at that React code and say, well, that's much better because, you know, I haven't had to learn this weird new syntax, like this hash each as array as number. Like, what is that? I don't want to have to learn a new syntax. To which I always reply, like, if that syntax is too hard for you to learn, then maybe programming is the wrong profession. It's obviously pretty straightforward what's happening there. You know, it's just relative priorities. Like, my background is in journalism. Svelte was built for me to solve the problems that I faced as a working journalist, needing to hit deadlines. And it takes a lot less time to write the code on the top than it takes to write the code on the bottom. And so that's why we ended up where we did.
I think it's really cool thinking about it in terms of what you're describing of like managing a world in flux. And I kind of like you said, React is good if you're dealing with like a data intensive, like a large code base, like a lot of data flowing through it. Then I feel like React does kind of feel like it's got those power tools for dealing with these like large flows of data and stuff. It's for, like you said, it's for slicing time. Whereas if you're dealing with something that feels more like objects, something that feels more solid, something that feels more visual, if you're slicing space, Svelte's got your back. I think I'm probably gonna think about it that way from now on.
Yeah, I mean, historically, I think we probably over-indexed on that problem. Like, how can we solve 90% of problems in a very straightforward way? Can we provide some syntax that makes this common use case super easy? And that's great for a lot of use cases. But then when you hit that 10% of the things where you really do need some advanced programming, that's where Svelte 3 and 4 start to fray a little bit. And over the years since Svelte 3 came out and people have started to build more and larger applications, we've started to see people hit those boundaries. And so that is really what Svelte 5 is all about. We're trying to preserve the simple cases, keep those as simple as they are today, but also give people the extra power and flexibility and composability that people in the React world take for granted.
Am I right in thinking that you're talking about the $ operator?
Among other things, yeah. Like, that is a great example of something that, you learn it in the first 10 minutes of using Svelte, and it feels like, coding with the wind in your hair and everything. But like when you start to use it more extensively, you find that actually it's a little bit of a trap, because inside that $: statement, we're operating under slightly different rules.
Yeah.
Like, that code will rerun when the compiler says that it should rerun. And when you start to put more and more logic in there, and then realize that you can't really refactor it out without changing the behavior, that becomes a little bit frustrating. And that's the kind of problem that we're solving in Svelte 5 by taking some of the responsibility out of the compiler and putting it into the runtime using our signal mechanism. And like, based on everything that we've seen from using Svelte 5 to re-implement things that we maintain, I think that people are hopefully going to find that we still have this really nice, elegant syntax for common problems, but we also have the ability to do things in a more robust and scalable fashion than we could before.
What would React have to do for you to hang up your hat and say, all right, I'm going to get a job as a React developer?
Oh, wow. A lot of the things that come with Svelte, like transitions and animations and styles as part of your component definition, all of those, I would really be reluctant to give those up. And you can do those things in React. Like, you have to install some packages and you have to do things in a slightly different way, but it's all possible. You can do all that. But it doesn't feel as nice, and they would have to make it feel as nice. That stuff needs to be built in. It needs to become with part of the framework. The framework needs to consider these problems to be part of its domain, rather than we're just concerned with reconciling the DOM and all of these other problems. We're going to leave that to userland. That's a perfectly legitimate and understandable stance to take, but it's not the stance that I want my framework to take. And so it's not the stance that Svelte takes. And for me to not use Svelte and use React instead, that would have to be quite a big philosophical shift, which is, I think, a good and healthy thing. The fact that we have these different projects in the ecosystem that have these different philosophies. If you want to be a React developer, if you subscribe to the React philosophy, then use React. If you subscribe to the Svelte philosophy, that things should be a little bit more encapsulated and focused on day-to-day problems, then come and use Svelte. And if you're somewhere in between, if you prefer the aesthetics of a different framework, Solid, Vue, whatever it is, then you use those. I don't see all of these things as in competition so much.
Mm-hmm.
We're just occupying different niches in the ecosystem, and I think it's important that all of those things exist and continue to be meaningfully different so that people actually have a meaningful choice.
Yeah, this is just such an exciting time. I feel like there's so much innovation happening in the web development sphere. I feel like it's really a golden age for web development, with all these different frameworks, which are all coming up with different approaches to solving problems, or coming up with the same approaches to solving problems. And I'm really excited to see where it goes. And I genuinely hope that you do not hang up your hat and become a React developer. And if you want to learn more about Svelte, you can check out our feature interview with Rich, which we did at his apartment in New York City back in December. And otherwise, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you.